So good evening, class. My name is Martin Fury. I'm going to be going over the UN Sustainable Development Goal that I found the most interesting. So the one that I found the most interesting was Goal 8, Decent Work and Economic Growth. So essentially what this is a continuation of the Millennium Development Goal, which the UN established in the year 2000, which was to eliminate global poverty by half. So not only did the UN achieve the Millennium Development Goal of eliminating global poverty in half, but they actually completed it early. So the goal was set to originally be met by 2015. That goal was actually met by 2010. And so now in 2015, when the Sustainable Development Goals were established, the UN decided, okay, we've seen good progress with this in the past. Let us now continue this progress. And by 2030, let's eliminate all extreme poverty in the world. And extreme poverty is defined as anybody living under $1.90 a day. Now, this isn't the only part of the goal. There's actually about 8 subsections listed on the UN's website that relate to this goal, but some of those include increasing workforce participation rates around the world, improving the quality of work that individuals participate in, maintaining GDP growth in the poorest countries at about 7% annually, and allowing participation of not only men, but also women and the youth in global workforces, also rural areas. So one of the things that the global community and the international community has seen with the decreasing in poverty rates is that the concentration of wealth is accumulating in cities. How do you address, especially like I mentioned already, sub-Saharan Africa, how do you address these huge populations of farmers and people who just live in overall rural communities? How do you address their lack of economic development? So now, having identified the problem and who's actually the most affected by the problem, who are these groups that are trying to solve this issue, trying to either aggregate data, provide solutions, or just even provide direct assistance to those who need it the most? So a couple of them that I've identified are the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, the World Bank, the UN Capital Development Fund, or the UNCDF, and the International Labor Office. All right, so now knowing that, what are some of the main problems that are currently have been identified? So one of the major problems is that 600 million people still live in that extreme poverty level, that less than $1.90 a day level. And not only do 600 million people live in that level, but there's been a global market slowdown. So the IMF has actually identified that global markets and GDP growth is slowing. So I'm going to show you an image. And essentially what this image is showing is the IMF's aggregation of data from 2000 to present day, and the rates of GDP growth not only until present day, but until 2024. So what the IMF is indicating is that by this data that we can't expect to have the same rate of growth that the world is used to. So economic development is slowing. Now, what is causing this issue? There's a couple of theories. Some of the theories include the U.S.-China trade wars having an impact on it, and the transition from manufacturing to service and IQ economies is also disrupting global GDP development. Another issue is income inequality. So growing income inequality is something that's been identified by many economists. So I'll give you a couple examples of who has actually identified this problem. Harvard professor Steven Pinker has identified this. President and CEO of the Canadian Council of International Cooperation, Julia Sanchez, has identified this as an issue. But what does income inequality mean when it comes to economic development? Is it a major issue? How is it affecting the globe? I mean, we know it's a fact. I'm going to show you another image that shows that overall income distribution has changed. So in 2004, the amount of people who controlled the income in the bottom and middle classes were much higher than today, where a lot of the income is controlled by the top 20%. Another issue that has been shown is just cultures and governments that do not promote inclusion, either for women or just inclusion for individuals of the populace into markets. So what are the solutions to these problems, right? Getting that 600 million people of extreme poverty into the above that threshold of $1.90 a day One of the things is, the World Bank thinks is general infrastructure, right? Rural development, better energy grids, investing more money into, how people receive electricity, their food, agriculture. Those things are incredibly important. The UNCDF actually has three tiers or three blocks that they focus on when it comes to economic development: inclusion in the economy, making sure that everybody has access to markets; local development, right? Making sure that centralized governance isn't the only way that an economy is developing. So having local offices that are not only concentrated around, say, the capital of a nation or in major cities, but also in rural areas, and then local investment overall. Making sure that certain projects have some footing so that global or foreign investment occurs, even just local investment occurs, in developing access to education and adequate healthcare. These were big issues that were identified when it came to inclusion of women in economies. Most women and girls don't have access to the same education benefits that males do in a lot of countries. So giving them the ability to become literate, giving them the ability to learn skills that would be applicable in markets and in economies, all allows for them to have better access to the economies and to therefore allow for a ladder for them to climb out of poverty. So researcher and editor at the Index of Economic Freedom, Anthony Kim, makes this point that also, freeing markets is another way to have a more equitable opportunity for women and the youth in rural areas to pursue economic development. So, pressuring governments to open markets, not having so many, centralized planning or taxes or things interfering with development is another possibility. And I'll quote from his piece: in other words, the greater the economic freedom in a nation, the easier for its people to work, save, consume, and ultimately live their lives in dignity and peace. So this points directly towards freeing markets as a greater chance for people lifting themselves out of poverty. And then the World Bank also thinks a solution might be more direct transfers to the extreme poor. So in this graph that I'm showing you, it indicates that the direct transfers of money to the poor is more effective in eliminating poverty than subsidies. Now this kind of seems like a no-brainer. Obviously, if you give poor people money, they're going to be less poor, right? But that's not actually what the solution is saying. So what the solution is saying is by giving money to local communities, they are now able to invest that money and identify certain things that the money could go towards to develop the economy. So this has actually been a weakness of the international community in the past. So NYU economist and former World Bank economist, Professor William Easterly, explains that in this clip.
Markets place decisions in the hand of consumers and entrepreneurs who know best what works for them. Let me give you an example of what happens when you don't do that. There was a UN-appointed commission called the UN Broadband Commission that was chaired by Rwanda's dictator Paul Kagame. And Kagame himself set the tone for the commission. He said, broadband is so wonderful. He said, the transformational impact of broadband on people's lives and global economies is no longer questionable. What actually works at the bottom is often a surprise that is best figured out by those at the bottom, by consumers and entrepreneurs. It turns out that consumers around the world wanted cell phones a lot more than they wanted broadband. Cell phone subscribers have rocketed in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. They now total 444 million subscribers of cell phones, reaching even very poor people in Africa who are able to buy a cell phone in very small incremental minutes at kiosk in every rural area and road.
So as you can see, I mean, he's making the point that essentially, if given the opportunity, local communities are going to know what to do with their money much more than an international community. So now moving on to income inequality. So I mentioned Steven Pinker and Julio Sanchez before. So what are their views? So I'm going to show you what Steven Pinker has to say about this issue specifically.
I don't think inequality is a good thing, but I think it's the wrong thing to take aim at.
Because
what's morally relevant is how well off people are, not that everyone have the same amount of income. That is, we should care about fairness. We should care about people having enough, that they should live pleasant, adequate, stimulating lives. But the fact that there are other people who live even more pleasant lives is not morally relevant.
Clearly here, Steven Pinker is making the argument that, it doesn't matter. Income equality doesn't matter. We shouldn't care about how much money these rich people have. We should be more aware of what money these extremely poor people don't have. Let's focus on that. Let's not focus on the concentrations of wealth. But Julia Sanchez, counters this point when she says, essentially, no, this is a moral outrage. We shouldn't have rich people having this much income.
That is, not a sustainable model for a society. So there is a real issue that we need to address here. Again, I say it's closing that gap. It's not, aspiring that everybody has the same income, but making sure that there are systems in place so that wealth is shared in society through different mechanisms, and that we don't have people who are in extreme poverty while at the same time you have people who are, wealthier than, to a degree that they can't do much with that
So
wealth.
now, after going over the UN Sustainable Development Goal of decent work and economic growth, a little bit of its history, how it was developed, what the goal is now, how the goal tries to address the people who are the most affected, women, youth, rural areas, what groups are trying to address this issue, what the solutions are, and what experts in this field actually think of the solutions. That basically sums up the entire presentation. I thank you very much for listening, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week and happy holidays.